full screen. I uh yeah, so this soundtrack came out. It's on Bandcamp. Hooray! And I'm just wanting to talk about the sound design that went into the songs. Yeah, and just about it's been about like 6 months in the making, and it's finally done. Super happy that it's out. Yeah, so the soundtrack that I got commissioned for, it was in, they wanted kind of pop mixed with noise and a lot of environmental. And so my process kind of going into figuring out the sound design for this was thinking about how to communicate what was part of the world, like what the characters were hearing, and what was the score. So I like the idea that that line between like what the characters could hear and when the score starts was really vague. So I used a lot of samples of the world that the characters were in, like cars going by, and like people in the distance, pens tapping and footsteps, and all these like kind of city sound effects, and then kind of structured a lot of the songs. For things that were instruments, they had a lot of they had a lot of processing, a lot of things that made them sound like they're coming from speakers, or that they had a tape saturation, or like especially for like school records, they would when the instruments or the samples reached the desk, they would get slated, and then if they wanted to put EQ or compression on something, it would keep getting saturated, and some of the lows and some of the highs would get cut out. And this like if that keeps happening throughout your process, then you end up with this kind of really unique sound that characterized like everything we listened to before like the 2000s when we had digital recording. So all the instruments in the soundtrack has that tape saturation, like as if it was recorded on an old school desk. But the sound effects, the ambience, and the cityscapes that are layered on top of that don't have that saturation, except when those sound effects start becoming part of the music, and then that tape saturation is introduced slowly. So yeah, so I wanted to show you the actual audio files, like all the stems, like that separated for each song, and my computer said no, I could not do that because that would be way too much CPU. Uh, and samples versus like, you know, just like sound effects or like cityscapes, and trying to like merge those two. So we look at this part. So this part comes at the end of Goon's theme, and it's a lot of ambience, and so we have this kind of transition from a song structure, and you can kind of see it here in the waveform.
Wait, no, I have to take a shit.
Yeah, so is one of my favorite moments from the series because what the filmmakers did was they actually had the soundtrack come out of a tape deck in a car, which is such a freaking cool and on set. So the soundtrack is actually part of like it's actually like the actual actors are hearing it. And so when I knew that I wanted to bring the soundtrack as like a standalone, I added the tape back in. So that's kind of like mimicking their artistic choice, which was such an incredible thing to do. Yeah, and then like having like having the soundtrack stop when they the cassette player in the car is really cool. I don't actually know how they did that because they would have to have they didn't actually put it on a cassette, like the soundtrack on a cassette, but they had it like come out like a little specific kind of reference, and then for them to change the button, which again is cool. And so that was a Goon's theme, and that leads into this song. It's a very ambient song called "Intimacy," which scores like a really kind of dramatic part of the series. And for this, almost the entire song is as a sample of one chord out of a rote that's kind of warped and shifted around. But what I'm doing is I'm playing with the vinyl saturation, as if this is coming out of a vinyl player. In the series, there's a very kind of reveal of a character's past. And so instead of kind of inverting this trope I've established of always having instruments have these effects, instead of like, no, this is like kind of in the character's head, and it wouldn't have any of these it wouldn't have any of the attributes of like played on the physical world. So let me see if I can just find that part, and just so we can listen to that really quick. Yeah, so that part is cool because in the series we cut between two scenes where there's like a reveal, and then we cut to these characters kind of outside bonding as if they've like kind of like overcome this like really hard thing. And so when they're inside, it's coming the soundtrack is coming off of a vinyl player, kind of like auto pan cut, and then we scrap the vinyl sound effect because now they're outside. And the character, as if the music is kind of scoring the character's emotions. And we hear other effects, so we hear like crickets, and we hear cars going by, kind of like wind, all underneath the instrumentation, kind of have the world be a part of the soundtrack. So this is Intimacy, leads into a really crazy song, the only fight scene of the series. And this is super compressed and just so much duration. As if it's like a punk song that you're listening to off of like a blown cassette player, and yeah, and yeah. So the I I really like that. You can see the waveform is super compressed, like compared to Intimacy, where there's like ebbing and flowing, and it's really engine revving that's kind of vocoded, so we get a little more pitch in there. But the drums, especially, those are all like those are kitchen plates being banged around as if he's like smashing things. I wanted it to just feel kind of primal. And so we take city sound effects, but then we actually add this tape saturation as if it's part of the score. And I know the creators really love that because they're going for this kind of real industrial vibe. And the cool thing about these hip hop is that the same mechanisms that like sampling and tape and vinyl players and tape. All those things also were the characteristics of noise during the 90s, and there was a lot of like. And so it was not uncommon to hear like people like weird tapes where like people were like rapping over just like people knocking on wood or just like grass crinkling or whatever. So I love that. I love that kind of it is a little out there. It uses all the tools that were available, which is really cool. This song is the second to last song. It's a multi-layered song. There's a multi-phase song. There's about 3 songs kind of smashed together into one. And where we're kind of alternating between having like a really dynamic track with like a lot of headroom, as you can kind of see here, and then like really compressing it. So this track kind of has the headroom, kind of alternates headroom, and has a lot of sound effects that are incidental and have no tape saturation, and then have a lot of sound effects that are part of the music. So let's take a little listen to that. So that transition, it took me a really long time. You probably heard, I'm not sure how good the sound quality is on YouTube, but you probably heard like footsteps. And the footsteps are marking the tempo of the track. That's kind of keeping the whole weird thing together, is this kind of constant footsteps. And we're supposed to be building a lot of tension. And actually in the series, those footsteps aren't connected to anything. Real anxious moment, whether he has this like really hard decision in front of him, and he's kind of going a little crazy, and aren't actually tied to anything happening in the shot. And right before, you can kind of hear it right before the transition, the footsteps start to break because they're increasing in tempo, into a full-on sprint, and it sprints at the viewer. So I have a distancing effect to make this so the footsteps sound like they're really distant. And then as the footsteps arise, slowly take that off, as if it's running straight towards the viewer. And it creates this really kind of anxiety-inducing transition. So one more time. Right. And then we're into the other song. That was really cool, especially because when you see the series, you're like, who is walking? And then you have this transition into a character running. So the soundtrack kind of foreshadows what's about to happen, which is also another cool feature that I like. So in there, there's samples of seagull. If you have a lot of samples of seagulls, it kind of sounds like people screaming, like actual people screaming. Like I know seagulls are annoying, but having a lot of delay and reverb on it just kind of creates this like really uncomfortable effect. Um, yeah, uh, that is that is a good chunk of the soundtrack. For the rest of the soundtrack, I'm kind of, you know, repeating those elements to kind of reinforce them, and to give, to kind of play around with that. So a lot of like, you know, noise and sound effects, and city elements, and trying to compose around where I think the characters, um, and that was something I talked a lot with the creators about, because they wanted, you know, a really dynamic soundtrack. And towards the end of the process, I was writing faster than they were able to film, which is really cool. Uh, yeah, so they could actually hear, um, they could hear the soundtrack before they were about to film, and that's how, of like having the soundtrack come out of the tape deck, or sampling something on set and then sending it to me, to play around with, kind of came about. We're kind of coming close to the end of the stream, and the end of the soundtrack. These first two stuff. Actually, why don't we talk about the main theme? So the Bodega Nights, kind of main theme. This was the first thing I wrote for them. That was a proof of only supposed to write one song, and then they heard this song. Awesome. Oh hey. Uh, uh, yeah, thanks for checking out the sound quality. I'm glad it's good. Uh, yeah, the main theme. So I did a similar thing that I would end up repeating later, which was have the soundtrack start off, very kind of distorted, as if it's coming off of like a vinyl player. The city sound effects on top. Yeah, I love that. That actually features a lot of my guitar playing. I have this really, really, really terrible acoustic guitar that I have access to, in the city, and it's just like super plunky. And you have like a lot of like the strings have been replaced in a while, so you have a lot of string noise. And I actually love that, and ended up that, in the soundtrack. And then there's a little bit of dulcimer, which is actually my friend Jacob playing dulcimer. He sent me a file, just like hammering random chords, and I was able to sample that. That actually comes in kind of later. It's this very, it's kind of a low of a top layer, later in the track, that I like a lot. So it features a lot of instrumentation, but then I treat my instrumentation as if I were trying to write, like in the 90s, and sampling myself. So I take like loops of myself playing. In fact, play the same chords throughout the entire song, but instead what I end up doing is I play a few chords, and then add a effect, and then just repeat those chords as if I'm sampling myself, and that's a really cool effect. Yeah, and that's the main theme. That's the Bodega Nights theme. So that's really cool. I think that's about it. The last song, the kind of climax of this series, yeah, the last song, the climax of the series, just is kind of this wall of noise. You can actually see it in the waveform. It's just compressed. there's a lot going on to the point where it's not really musical anymore. It's just kind of energy, and the creators wanted it to kind of the soundtrack to kind of break down, kind of just be intense and not really, you can't really distinguish one instrument from another. So I'll just play that, and then I'll call it a night. Thanks for the few of you who stuck around and are watching this. Thank you so much. That means the world.